Do you like your army?
I look forward to seeing them in action.
They'll do their job well.
If all Star Wars scenes were written like this, Attack of the Clones could have just won the Academy Award for Best Screenplay. Now, before you all call me crazy, today we're going to talk about this conversation between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Jango Fett in Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and find out why it's one of the better scenes in Star Wars, particularly the Star Wars prequels. Now for this scene, if you cut out the introductory and the closing dialogue, there are only 22 lines in this whole scene, but quite a lot is packed into this scene. First things first though, it's important to identify the audience perspective going into this scene. Because of a previous scene where we see Jango give fellow bounty hunter Zam Wesell the deadly Calhouns, I think I'm pronouncing that right, we know who Obi-Wan is after already. The filmmakers already gave that part away, but more on that later. But this means that the primary purpose of the scene is for Obi-Wan to discover this information for himself. The secondary purpose is to expose some of Jango Fett's layers so that we can better understand who he is as a character. For example, how Jango processes threats. The technique that George Lucas uses to write this scene is called subtext. At its heart, subtext is when characters say one thing, but really mean something else. It's usually fairly subtle, or it should be in most cases, and it's a powerful tool characters use to try and achieve their goals or try to get what they want. Another way to put it is, subtext is the art of saying what's not being said. If that's confusing, think of it this way. It's what characters really mean, what they're really saying underneath what they're actually saying. They're saying one thing, asking one question if you will, but really asking something else entirely. For example, when Obi-Wan asks,
Ever made your way as far into the interior as Coruscant?
what he's really asking is, did you organize an assassination attempt on Senator Amidala? But of course he's not gonna ask that. That's too obvious of a question for Obi-Wan to ask. Jango Fett's answer would be, no, I wouldn't be a very good bounty hunter if I answered that question that way. So, what does Obi-Wan do instead? Well, throughout this scene, Obi-Wan constantly asks Jango questions that seem to have relatively little importance at the surface level. What Obi-Wan's really doing though is trying to catch Jango in a trap by asking these seemingly roundabout questions or making subtle declaratory statements that infer something else. His questions have a deeper, alternate meaning. For example, Obi-Wan starts with trying to catch Jango Fett off guard by praising the clone army that's been built from Jango's DNA.
Your clones are very impressive. You must be very proud.
Jango responds nonchalantly with,
I'm just a simple man trying to make my way in the universe.
or in actuality what he's really saying is, two can play this game, Mr. Jedi. Jango Fett knows exactly what Obi-Wan's doing here because he's a smart bounty hunter and dishes the subtext right back at him. The fact that Jango instantly understands what's going on and has the presence to respond in like form shows us, the audience, that Fett is more than just muscle. He has the brains to be the most feared bounty hunter in the galaxy. At this moment, Jango knows that Obi-Wan has gained a slight upper hand because he has a piece of information that Jango does not.
Then you must know Master Cypher Diaz.
Jango needs a moment to decide how to respond, so he manufactures a pause to tell Boba Fett to close the door to the room that is hiding the most important incriminating piece of evidence that Jango has, his armor. Jango uses this quick break in the conversation to make a decision on how he is going to respond, and he responds almost flippantly with,
Never heard of him.
returning the verbal duel to an even ground, as it's now Obi-Wan's turn to be surprised. With this never heard of him line, Jango switches off the subtext and responds to Obi-Wan in like form. Since Jango truly doesn't know who Sifo Dyas is, presuming, responding with the truth that he's never heard of him is his attempt to gain the upper hand in the conversation. Notice that Obi-Wan's response is simply,
Really?
he doesn't believe Jango, of course. Jango notices this and jumps in and for the first time offers a piece of information that actually hasn't been asked.
I was recruited by a man called Tyrannus on one of the moons of Bogdan.
Obi-Wan's second one-word response
Curious.
reveals that 1, he has never heard of Tyrannus, and 2, that he still doesn't believe Jango. The conversation is now effectively at a stalemate. Both parties have offered surprising new information, and both are processing how to proceed. It is Jango who makes the next play though.
Do you like your army?
So, what is Jango really saying and doing here? He's redirecting the conversation back to where Obi-Wan started it, using subtext to bring the discussion full circle, and underneath showing Obi-Wan that he's just done answering questions about himself. Which is interesting because Obi-Wan's answer,
I look forward to seeing them in action.
is a very non-Jedi type of response. Jedi are supposed to love peace, not war, and Obi-Wan is kind of the epitome of the Jedi code at this point, from a certain point of view. So, Obi-Wan's response is a challenge, Both characters know that while this conversation is nearing its closure, their interactions will continue. Jango acknowledges Obi-Wan.
They'll do their job well. I'll guarantee that.
He acknowledges the challenge with more subtext by basically saying, yeah, these clones all came from me, so if you try to take me on, I'm better than they are. Effectively. So Obi-Wan formally closes the conversation.
Thank you for your time, Jango.
But Jango gets in the last little, punch.
Always a pleasure to meet a Jedi.
This is such a fantastic line to close the scene with because what self-respecting bounty hunter wants to meet a Jedi? None of them, of course. Always a pleasure to meet a Jedi is a line dripping with subtext. We can infer all sorts of things about potential backstory moments between Jango and Jedi, but it's the irony of the line that makes it absolutely the best line for the moment. Of course, this line is an outright lie, but the irony and subtext are what makes it hit home and gives it a slightly intentional comedic touch. This is a scene where not a lot is learned on the surface, but oh, so much conflict starts boiling underneath the surface, and we leave the scene not being able to wait for the next confrontation between these two characters. But there's one thing that could have brought the scene to the next level. That dratted Jango Fett Zam Wessel scene. This scene completely undermines the Obi-Wan scene because it reveals who the bounty hunter behind the assassination attempt is, like right from the beginning, right from the first less than 20 minutes of the movie. In the Obi-Wan scene, there's never a doubt that Jango is the bounty hunter Obi-Wan is looking for. This scene is kind of written to play like, oh, maybe that's someone else's armor in the next room, but we got a good hard look at the armor in the Zam Wessel scene. That's never, ever really legitimately a question for the audience. Which is why that Jango Zam scene should have been left in the editing room floor. If the scene had just been cut, there would have been an extra layer of tension for the audience to feel within the scene, as we would have also been trying to guess, alongside Obi-Wan, if Jango is the correct suspect or not. The quick shot of the helmet and armor on the floor would have truly added some additional suspense at that point specifically, since all we would have seen from Jango previously is a quick, faraway, distant shot of him just rocketing into the air. Definitely not enough to make a 100% judgment call on, with the exception of maybe the hardcore Star Wars fans with sharp eyes. The crazy irony though is that this Jango Zam Wessel scene wasn't even in the original script. It was added during the pickup shoots in order to give more clarity to the assassination attempt. Oh well, what can you do? It ended up in the movie, and that's that. But ultimately, there are 4 main tips for learning how to write subtext, and you can check them out in this video where we break down subtext in the James Bond film Casino Royale. Until next time, when you write your scenes, try to make them a little bit like this.
I'm just a simple man trying to make my way in the universe.
And a little less like this.
You are in my very soul, torment.